Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. Today we're going to talk about the New Republic, or the time from about 1787 through 1823. Learning targets. We'll discuss the structure of the federal government and the emergence of new political parties. We'll talk about major foreign policy events like the War of 1812 and the Monroe Doctrine. We'll talk about the major events of Jefferson's presidency, and we'll talk about the growing differences between the North and the South with one sub-target there. So let's get started. Washington's government, he organizes it, President Washington that is, he orders it into, he has a cabinet, and two most important members of that cabinet are his Secretary of State and his Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. These are his most trusted advisors, but they don't get along at all. So Hamilton, his idea to kind of secure the nation's financial future is to charter a national bank. But in the Constitution, remember, we have a limited government. Where does it say we can do that? Well, he points to the Constitution's necessary and proper clause, also known as the elastic clause, as the power to do this. And this debate over whether or not the Constitution allows for a national bank will create political parties. And then just a little bit more about the elastic clause. It basically says Congress has the power to do all things necessary and proper for the good of the nation. So that's very broad, elastic. It can be stretched to do many things. So Hamilton's bank creates the parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Basically, the Federalists, you can see there, their beliefs, they're complete opposites. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, thought that the centralized government should have more power. They want to base the economy on industry and trade as opposed to farming. They're pro-British, and they support what is called a loose construction of the Constitution. And so to the Federalists, what that means is, since it's not prohibited in the Constitution, they're allowed to do it. And I'm sure many of you would agree with that as well. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, or the modern day Democrats, this part is the only party that has stood the test of time and is still here today. They're led by Thomas Jefferson. They think states should have more power as opposed to the central government. They want to base the economy on farming. They're pro-French, and they basically say, since establishing a bank is not a government power, they should not be allowed to charter one. So foreign policy issues at this point. Right after our revolution and our writing of the Constitution, the French have their revolution beginning in 1789. And the U.S. stays neutral. And since we stayed neutral, Britain began seizing our sailors and forcing them into their navy. They're basically kidnapping our sailors, and that's a practice called impressment. Over 9,000 U.S. sailors are impressed during this point. British also still has forts on the U.S. side of the Great Lakes. Remember, Britain owns Canada, but they're still on our side of the Great Lakes, so they're basically testing us. John Jay is sent to negotiate a treaty and signs Jay's treaty, but it only delays the war. The French are offended at that point because they helped us in the revolution, and now we're helping in signing treaties with the British, so they begin seizing our merchant ships. And then what's going on out west in the Northwest Territory? The Indians are conflicting with the U.S. out here, and General Anthony Wayne, whom Fort Wayne is named after, wins Ohio and southern Indiana at this point, so from the Indians. So after two terms, Washington retires in 1796, and Vice President John Adams wins election in 1796 to become our second president. And his most famous acts that he signed are the Alien Act and the Sedition Act. And these are very, very controversial because it makes it more difficult for immigrants to become citizens, the Alien Act. But the Sedition Act basically makes it a crime for citizens to publicly discredit the federal government. But what about our First Amendment rights? Like, people were screaming bloody murder that this was unconstitutional, but we don't have the power of judicial review yet for the Supreme Court to rule it unconstitutional. So citizens are very opposed to these acts, and this is credited for Jefferson's election in 1800. Then let's skip ahead to our next foreign policy event, the War of 1812. And the British Navy again begins seizing American ships and American sailors. Jefferson then asked Congress for an embargo, or suspending trade with Britain. And at this point, they still are seizing American ships, and we can't let them push us around if we're an independent country. So the War of 1812 breaks out, which we're celebrating the 200th anniversary here of recently, and finally ends tensions with Britain. And some major events are Britain burns the Capitol building in Washington and the White House. The U.S. tries and fails to invade British Canada. We defeated the British in other major attacks, and we signed a treaty in 1815. And no boundaries change. It was basically a stalemate between us, but it does show the stability of the new nation in that we are here to stay. So here's your causes and effects. British interfere with American shipping, American expansion into the western frontier because they're still on our side of the Great Lakes. Southerners want Florida, which is owned by Spain. Warhawks want to go to war to expel Britain completely from North America and take over Canada as well. And the effects are, we need a strong standing army. It encourages American nationalism. This brings an end to the Federalist Party. It shatters the strength of Native American resistance on the frontier, and it paves the way for our acquisition of Florida in the next decade after it. Then lastly, the Monroe Doctrine is something that President Monroe, James Monroe, signs in 1823. And it really doesn't mean much now, but we are going to use it. Teddy Roosevelt is going to call upon it in the early 1900s and say that Europe should not mess with the Western Hemisphere. They don't have to meddle in American republics. So we promised to stay out of the Eastern Hemisphere if they promised to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Our original goal was to prevent Spain from regaining her colonies to the south, to the west, all over the Western Hemisphere. The major events of Jefferson's presidency are the case of Marbury versus Madison and the Louisiana Purchase. Basically, the case of Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court case, you don't need to know the specifics of it, but know that the Supreme Court gives itself the power of judicial review. And judicial review is the power to review the constitutionality of federal law. So if they deem if a law is passed and it's brought before the Supreme Court and they deem it's unconstitutional, they can't do the law anymore. They'll get rid of it. And in 1803, he buys land from France extending from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. It doubles the size of the country overnight, and that's the Louisiana Purchase. We'll then later send Lewis and Clark to explore this new territory and tell us all about it. And we mentioned this earlier in the chapter, but we do have increasing changes between the regions here. The North is becoming much more industrialized and making stuff in factories like clothing and machinery because they don't have very good farming soil up there. They have more water power and more rivers to run factories. In the South at this point is becoming more agricultural because they're relying on enslaved labor. And cotton will become the new crop of choice because of the invention of the cotton gin, which is short for engine, cotton gin. It's invented by Eli Whitney, and it makes the harvesting of cotton much, much easier and the pulling the seeds out of cotton much, much easier. And so cotton is now in great demand because we make clothes in the northern factories and they make clothes in Europe at the same time. So this will lead to the Civil War, these increasing changes between the regions. And that is all I have for you. Make sure you fill out your learning targets. If they're a little bit out of order, I apologize. And I will see you in class. Bring any questions you have. Good night.